We believe in one God, as revealed by Scripture in the person of Jesus Christ. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe that He died for our sins, to restore all things in right relationship with the King. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe that all things are good, that what God says in His Word is true, and that He meant every word. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe the future's open, that God is free and He's Lord of the possibilities. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Hello and welcome to the Tattered Bible Podcast, where we study to show ourselves approved. So just a couple of things. First, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Please make sure it's respectful. So if you go to the bottom of our video, this is last time's video, because if I played this times, there will be a echo. We don't want that. But if you go to the bottom of this time's video too, you will see that there is this link tree here. And if you click on it, you have all my resources, channels that I endorse, including Paul Vendredi's channel, some churches, and some books. Also at the bottom of the video is link to, at the bottom of this video anyways, is the link to Paul Vendredi's 2 channels. And also, if you would go to paulvendredi.com, he's got good resources there. Hold on, where is this? Oh, yeah. Stop sharing. So without further ado, here is the always dapper Paul Vendredi.
Jacob, happy 2025.
Happy 2025.
Yeah, this is my New Year's Eve suit. I decided to wear it on New Year's Day this time around.
Well, you know, I haven't seen you since last year.
Exactly. It's been ages.
Get some every time.
Jacob, we got a lot of material to cover today, so I think we ought to just plunge right into it.
Okay.
Today we are covering chapters 16 through 21, I believe it was. Chapter 16 may very well be the most important chapter in Leviticus because that's the one that deals with the Day of Atonement. I should say the most important from our perspective because our adversaries in the Atonement School make great hay out of this chapter. This chapter is alluded to in the book of Acts, and it's also alluded to in chapters 9 and 10 of the book of Hebrews. We're starting out with chapter 16. I'm going to pull down the actual Bible here.
Sure.
And chapter 16 of Leviticus actually begins with a time cue. It's one of the few time cues in the book of Leviticus. We read, "And the Lord spake unto Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they offered before the Lord and died." That's chapter 16, verse 1. That's our time cue. That's telling us that this chapter occurs after the death of Nadab and Abihu. Well, Nadab and Abihu died in chapter 10. There's quite a number of intervening chapters, and we went over all that material. I will state again what I stated in our first episode. The contents of the book of Leviticus are out of order. At some point in history, probably during the Babylonian exile, the contents of Leviticus got jumbled or they got destroyed, somehow had to be reassembled. Let's just put it this way. Somehow the book became disassembled and it had to be reassembled. The tradition is that Ezra, or a group of people assigned by Ezra, put it back together. Whoever's responsible did a pretty sloppy job, because chapter 16 belongs after chapter 10. In my opinion, it actually makes a lot more sense when we read it in light of what came before it. And what came before it was the first narrative in the book of Leviticus. That narrative begins in chapter 8 and goes through chapter 9, and that's the opening week of the tabernacle. People tend to say the opening day of the tabernacle. That's not quite accurate, because at the end of chapter 8, the priests are confined in the tabernacle for 7 days. Then when the narrative resumes in chapter 9, then the consecration of the tabernacle resumes. So we should say the opening week of the tabernacle is chapters 8 through 9. Then the death of Nadab and Abihu and the aftermath thereof are found in chapter 10. So I'm going to do a real quick, very quick review of that, what we did last week when we talked about that opening week of the tabernacle. It began in chapter 8 with the priestly ordination, Moses washing Aaron and his sons. It moved on to Aaron then vesting Aaron and his sons. By the way, that's something that's done even in Eastern Orthodoxy. There's an entire liturgy where the subdeacons vest the bishop, but that's for another episode. It goes on to the consecration with oil, the consecration with blood, and then it goes on to the consecration of the appurtenances of the tabernacle with the blood from the ram of the burnt offering. Moses then goes on to consecrate the appurtenances and the priests with the ram of consecration's blood. And then it goes on to the very unusual consecration with bread. This is where Moses stacks up the bread, some of the meat, some of the offal onto the hands of Aaron, and then waves it for a wave offering. Apparently, this gesture is an idea of wafting the aroma of the sacrifice up to the nose of God. It's a concession to anthropomorphic thinking. Then we had Moses' portion, which was the ram of the wave offering. Finally, there's the consecration with blood and oil. This is where Moses sprinkles blood and oil onto the priest's garment. And at the end of this chapter, the priests are confined to the tabernacle for 7 days. We speculated last time that they might have been drinking themselves into a stupor during that 7 days, because in the Nadab and Abihu chapter, which is chapter 10, God goes on to give a law that no priest is allowed to do the services of the tabernacle while he's drinking alcohol. Going into chapter 9, the ordination continues. In fact, I'm just going to skip over all the details, except to say that the chapter concludes with heavenly fire manifesting itself to consume the sacrifices that have been laid on top of the altar. Chapter 10 begins right after that fire has manifested itself. We need to remember that the chapter and verse breaks are artificial. They're extremely helpful, but they're not in the original text. So in the original scroll, you would have read about the fire consuming the items on the altar, And then in the next sentence, you would have read about Nadab and Abihu putting coals into their censers and rushing into the tabernacle and then being consumed by the self-same fire. And after this is where we begin chapter 16.
Yeah. It's quite obvious that your hypothesis is correct. I mean, there's no, if nobody would take chapter 16 here and put it after all the stuff about boils and sores, and
Exactly.
if I remember correctly, that's what comes right before this.
You're right. It was what I called
order.
It was what I call the pus, blood, and semen chapter.
Yeah. No one would put this after that. If you're looking for a logical order, and most of the Bible is in a logical order, if you're looking for a logical order, you would put this after Nadab and Abihu, because you have the timestamp. Sorry, I'm pointing and they can't see my hands. You have the timestamp right here.
Jacob, we might want to make that a little bigger. We may want to blow up the text slightly larger like we had it last time.
You know what? I might just go back.
Right.
I'm going to have to tweak that sitting. I thought it looked cool, but if they can't see it on the screen, it doesn't do them any good.
Let me jump in here just to riff on something you said about order within the Bible. When I say that the contents of the book of Leviticus are manifestly out of order, and that the book was probably destroyed at one point and had to be reassembled, that's going to sit very ill with a number of people in the audience. In fundamentalism, we're taught that the Bible is absolutely perfect. A claim that doesn't make any sense, since even fundamentalists do apologetics. If the Bible were without any kind of crack or flaw, there would be no need for apologetics. The Bible would simply be self-affirming. But if people still object to my saying it's out of order, I want to invite them to look at the book of Proverbs. I have had, over the span of many years, the goal of memorizing the entire book of Proverbs. With many fits and starts, I've managed to get through the first 8 chapters and get those memorized. I'm eventually working on getting the whole book memorized. I can tell you, from reading that book over and over and from reciting it to myself, there is no discernible order in the book of Proverbs.
Yeah.
In fact, anytime a person reads a commentary on the book of Proverbs, all of the Proverbs are going to be reordered topically. They're going to be Proverbs about marriage, Proverbs about money, Proverbs about being open to rebuke and criticism, and on and on and on. Now, if we want to give even more, shall I say, even more on the edge here, we can say that the 4 Gospels are not in order. For years, for centuries, people have been harmonizing the 4 Gospels and putting them into harmonized texts. John MacArthur did that with a book called One Perfect Life, and it's a pretty good book if you just ignore his footnotes. The earliest extant attempt to harmonize the 4 Gospels was done by a man named Tatian, and the church that Tatian came from in Syria was so impressed with the work he did, a work known as the Diatessaron, that they actually threw out the 4 Gospels, replacing them with the Diatessaron. So it is not liberal to say that the contents of the Bible are out of order, or to postulate that perhaps they were one time in a different order. It is very obvious to me, and it's become obvious to you as well, that the contents of Leviticus are definitely out of order. I jumped in on what you were saying, so I'll turn it back over to you.
No, I think that's a good segue into chapter 16. And I've got my text turned up, so now all the grandmas in the audience, if we have any.
Now, that would include me. You just saw me put my glasses on. Gotta have on the readers for my old peepers now. But actually, that text is big enough for me to read without the
Yeah,
spectacles.
I turned sitting all the way up, and I changed the layout to the biggest layout for the text.
Jacob, let's jump into chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. This is the beginning of the Day of Atonement legislation. It starts with restrictions on entrance into the Holy of Holies. To remind the subscribers, the Holy of Holies was the enclosure within the enclosure in the tabernacle. The tabernacle had an exterior court that people could see into when the door of the tabernacle was open. And within that court, there was a tent. The first entrance, when you entered into the tent, the first place you came to was called the holy place or the sanctuary. And then you went into another place that was called the Holy of Holies. That contained the Ark of the Covenant. Prior to this, there were no restrictions on going in and out of the Ark of the Covenant. And Moses could go in and out there at will, which is interesting because he's not even a priest. He's from the tribe of Levi. He's from the clan of Kohath, but he's not a son of Aaron. He's a brother of Aaron. That means he's not a priest. So we have the restrictions on the entrance into the Holy of Holies, and there are enumerated some animals that are going to have to be gathered from the people that are going to be used in sacrifice. We begin with a bull for a sin offering and a sheep for a burnt offering. We go on to verse 5, and it dictates that a goat and a ram, goats and a ram have to be collected. There are 2 goats for the sin offering. These are the most famous animals in this chapter. We're going to get to this in a moment. And then there's a ram for a burnt offering. Verse 6. This regards the bullock. That was the bull that was mentioned earlier. Aaron offers it to atone for himself and his household. And in my opinion, this is a verse that's out of order. This belongs after verse 4 rather than after verse 5. Because you can, if you reassemble chapter 16, you can put together all the verses that pertain to the sacrificial goat and the scapegoat, and then put together all the verses that pertain to the bullock and the ram. Instead, they're all jumbled together, and it makes it very, very confusing. But I'm not going to say a whole lot of that about that in today's show. We're just going to go through this and give an overview of the chapter. Okay, and that bullock that is offered is not set to be killed until chapter 16, verse 11. So at this point, it's simply being designated as the bullock that's going to be sacrificed. Verses 7 through 10. This is where the lots are cast on the goats to determine which one is going to be the sacrificial goat and which is going to be the scapegoat. Lots could be said to be a tool of the occult. If you want to be really, really favorably inclined toward the book of Leviticus, you could say that a lot is nothing more than flipping a coin. We do this before football games. We flip a coin to find out who's going to kick off and who's going to receive. What this could mean, if we give Leviticus the benefit of every doubt, that they just flip a shekel. If it's heads, if it comes up heads, then it's the sacrificial animal. Tails, then it's the scapegoat, or vice versa. We don't know. The Bible is never clear on what lots are. Lots come up again in the book of Acts. There are people, I've spoke to one fundamentalist Protestant pastor who said that lots are a tool of the occult. Well, here you have a tool of the occult in the book of Leviticus. If it is a tool of the occult and it's not just flipping a coin, then what we have is God accommodating himself to the paganism of the Hebrews, yet again, accommodating it up to a point to keep them from worse paganism and worse occultism. Verses 11 through 14. This is where Aaron kills the bullock to atone for himself and for his household. The blood of this bull, Aaron then takes into the Holy of Holies to sprinkle onto the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. Let's be clear on our terminology. The mercy seat is the lid atop the Ark of the Covenant. If we're going to be real specific, the Ark of the Covenant is the box that contains the 10 Commandments. And then on top of it, you have the mercy seat. Sometimes when I refer to it, I just refer to it as one unit, and I just call it the Ark of the Covenant. When we want to be specific, then we say the Ark, and we say the mercy seat.
Yeah, before the Day of Atonement, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, before the Day of the Atonement, the whole point of the mercy seat is that is where heaven and earth meet. Like, that's where God comes down to give audience to his people. Whereas here now is the place where you sprinkle the blood. That's the difference of before and after.
I agree with your assessment. My opinion is that Christ is the Ark of the Covenant, or if you prefer, the mercy seat. He's referred to the mercy seat. He's called the Elasterion, which is the Septuagint's word for mercy seat in Romans chapter 3, verse 25. He's also called that, or the same word appears in the book of Hebrews, and a related word also appears in the epistle of 1 John, both in chapter 2 and in chapter 4. Thus, I am of the opinion that Jesus is the mercy seat. And in accord with what you just described, the New Testament tells us that there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. So Christ is where God comes down to mediate between God and man, just like you described the mercy seat.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on. Speaking of the mercy seat, verses 15 through 16. The goat for the people is then killed, and Aaron sprinkles the blood of that goat onto the mercy seat. Okay, in verse 17, we have the warning that only one person is allowed inside that tabernacle. That's talking about the high priest offering up the blood of the bull and the goat. Verses 18 through 19. The blood of the bull and the goat is then taken out into the courtyard and sprinkled onto the altar. I'm assuming that this is the altar where the sacrifices are burned and not the altar of incense, which is inside the holy place. Because when it refers to the altar of incense, it usually calls it that. It calls it the altar of incense. But sometimes it only says altar, and we have to take an educated guess which one it's talking about. Verses 20 through 22. This is the scapegoat passage. This is very important to us. So again, verses 20 through 22, maybe you want to read that to us since it's so key.
Yeah. And when he has made an end of reconciling the holy place and the tabernacle of the congregation and the altar, he shall bring the live goat, and Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel and all their transgressions in all their sins, putting them upon the head of the goat, and shall send him away by the hand of a fit man into the wilderness. And the goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities unto a land not inhabited, and he shall let go the goat in the wilderness. Do you want me to keep going?
No, let's cut it off right there. What you just read to us is the scapegoat passage. One of the goats has been sacrificed. That's the sacrificial goat. Now we have the second goat. This is the scapegoat. Aaron confesses the sins of the people over it. This is the only place in the book of Leviticus where we know that the priest says anything liturgically. Interestingly enough, it doesn't exactly tell us what he says. It just gives us a generality. You know, people who are Eastern Orthodox, they're familiar when they go into confession. The priest sometimes has a book, and sometimes he'll do this. With the cross, he'll simply point to a list of sins and say, which of these have you committed? And then there's a certain speech that he reads at the end of the confession as he's putting his stole over your head. Here, there's a confession, but we don't even know if there's anything formulaic said. Maybe Aaron just wings it. We do not know how to reconstruct these Levitical sacrifices completely accurately because we simply don't have enough information in the book of Leviticus. That in itself may be telling. Perhaps that means that we're not supposed to reconstruct this. And bear in mind, the Levitical sacrifices and how these sacrifices are done had to be reconstructed after the 70 years of Babylonian exile. When they came back, they did not have a temple. And as we have shown, they had to reconstruct the book of Leviticus. So the way that it was done in the prior generations is probably not exactly how it was recreated from the time of Zerubbabel forward. So that's a problem for people who think that these sacrifices represent Jesus, because the sacrifices manifestly had to change, at least in a small way, because it is impossible to recreate exactly what is done when we just have the book of Leviticus. There's what we call in technical writing tribal knowledge. Something that a technical writer has to do is go talk to all the engineers, all the technicians, and find out what they know about procedures and processes, because many of those procedures are written down or just partially written down. The technical writer has to get all the tribal knowledge out of the heads of those technicians, engineers, and other subject matter experts and put it in writing. That did not get done with the book of Leviticus. There is quite a bit of tribal knowledge that's not conveyed in this book.
If I remember correctly, and if you don't look favorably on anyone in the movie I'm fixing to bring up, you can just roll your eyes and pontificate on it later. I forget the name of the movie. It's the one with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson, where Jack Nicholson says, "You can't handle." Yeah. Repeat that clearly.
A Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men, yeah. Now, in The Few Good Men, in the trial sequence, she asks one of the people, "Hey, how do you know what to do in such and such case? Is there anywhere where this thing is written down? Is there anywhere where it's written down?" And the person says, "No, you just kind of learn it by watching everyone else, what they do in that case." And so this is a similar thing here. There's nothing written down about the liturgy used during the scapegoat. The priests learn what to do by watching the priests that came before them doing the same thing.
Right, and the difficulty is that when the Jews get back from exile, the priests who would have been doing this are dead, because a priest was in his office from the age of 30 to the age of 50. He began at 30 and he concluded at 50. So let's assume that in 586 we have the very youngest priests, and they're 30. The exile is over 70 years later. That means your very youngest priest is now 100 years old.
Yep.
I'm finding this really doubtful that they were able to get this out of the minds of the priests. And while they are in Babylonian exile with no temple, it's very doubtful that they placed a lot of emphasis on sacrificial religion. In fact, this is probably where Judaism became more of a religion of the word, because there were no sacrifices while they were in exile. So they had more of a type of synagogue worship. And this is when we start seeing synagogues proliferating throughout the Middle East, and then later in the diaspora of the Hellenistic period.
Yeah.
Let's go on.
Yeah. In fact, I'm working on a series behind the scenes right now about how Jesus and not the rabbinics is the continuation of the ancient Jewish faith. And part of the premise is that it was the prophets, not the rabbis or the priests, but the prophets who were the real representatives of God's word. And that Jesus is the continuation. That's not all he is, but he is the continuation of the prophetic tradition. That's not all he is, of course.
I am very amenable to that position, because the prophets, with regard to all these sacrifices, they say, "What doth the Lord require of thee, O man, but to walk humbly and to do justice," etc., etc. The prophets were very clear that these are not sacrifices of atonement, even though they are called such in quotation marks in the actual text of the Pentateuch. What I want to restate what I've said in our previous get-togethers. God is accommodating paganism. He accommodated paganism in Israelite religion in a very minor way prior to the golden calf. After the golden calf, we start getting a punitive accommodation. That's all of this ritual sacrifice that we have in the book of Leviticus. God is saying, okay, I'm going to make it even tougher on you. You're going to get paganism till it's coming out of your nostrils, but not so much that you're going to become satanic. So Leviticus is a punishment. And in my opinion, the Day of Atonement is a punishment within a punishment. The Day of Atonement is a punishment for Nadab and Abihu. So we've been talking in verses 20 through 22 about this scapegoat, and prior to that, we talked about the sacrificial goat. People want to tell us that this is the two natures of Christ, or somehow or other it represents Christ. Totally false. The Day of Atonement is only alluded to twice in the New Testament, and neither time is it directly named. It's alluded to in Hebrews chapters 9 and 10, and it's alluded to in the book of Acts chapter 27, when Paul is on a boat in foul weather and is fasting. This fast is related to the Day of Atonement. We're going to get to that in just a few verses. In my opinion, this chapter, which the opening verse of tells us comes right on the heels of the Nadab and Abihu event, is telling you that this is a reaction, a punishment for the Nadab and Abihu event, a penance, if you will. And what we have is the scapegoat representing one set of brothers of Aaron and the sacrificial goat representing the other set. You could say that the scapegoat is Ithamar and Eleazar, who survive that conflagration on the opening week of the temple. And you could say that the sacrificial lamb, the sacrificial goat rather, sorry for my confusing the terminology there, the sacrificial goat is Nadab and Abihu, because Nadab and Abihu are killed. So you have Nadab and Abihu killed, like the sacrificial goat, and you have Ithamar and Eleazar living, like the scapegoat. Or if you want to, you could even reverse it, and you could say that the scapegoat represents Nadab and Abihu, and the sacrificial goat represents Ithamar and Eleazar. I believe you can make an equally good case for either one of those permutations. Expressing an opinion there, but I think it's a good opinion, and it's based on reading through Leviticus 30 times and starting to piece it back together in what appears to be the correct order. Verses 23 through 24. This is where we have a sacrificial ram. So there are quite a number of animals on the Day of Atonement. We associate the Day of Atonement with a goat. In fact, there are two goats, and there's a ram, and there's a bullock. Okay, going on to verse 25. This is a bullock and a ram. The bullock and the ram that have been sacrificed, here's where their fat is burned on the altar. Okay, verse 26, we come back to the scapegoat. I was telling you moments ago that the verses of the goat should be put together and the verses of the bullock should be put together. When you do so, the whole chapter flows a lot more smoothly and is way less confusing. But I'm just going to tell you here that this belongs after verses 20 through 22. We're looking at verse 26. So this is where they have to do a ritual cleansing of the fit man who is going to escort the scapegoat to the edge of the camp and release it into the wilderness. Verses 27 through 28. Going back again to the remains of the bullock and the goat, the remainder, that which has not been offered as a sacrifice, the offal, is carted out of the camp and dumped. It doesn't say who does this. It could be a priest, it could be a Levite, it could even be a layman. Verses 29 through 34. I was talking about this moments ago, 29 through 34. God says that the Day of Atonement is going to be a day of fasting and affliction. That's what's alluded to in Acts chapter 27, verse 9. The Apostle Paul is fasting and afflicting himself on the Day of Atonement. We're looking at chapter 16, verses 29 through 34. The fact that God is saying that this is a day of fasting and affliction is proof to me that this is penance for the Nadab and Abihu event. It just seems very clear to me. It tells you that this is fasting and affliction. It's some kind of penance for what they did. We're done with chapter 16, going on to chapter 17, looking at verses 1 through 8. Chapter 17 has to do with rules about farm animals. It also has to do about rules about eating game animals. And then there are also some random statements in there about the day of about the kosher laws. So this one is kind of an admixture of things too. I'm in the process of reassembling all of the verses of Leviticus into what I think is the proper order. And verse 17 is going to be broken up and distributed through much earlier chapters. In my opinion, this belongs with the first 7 chapters, which are all about the sacrifices. Verses 1 through 8, this talks about peace offerings. Well, the first time the peace offerings came up was, if memory serves, Leviticus chapter 3. Here we are in chapter 17, and we're learning more details about the peace offering. This is yet more evidence that the book was hastily reassembled. If you want to be less generous, we can say it was sloppily reassembled. Now, what's interesting too, this is a quirk of its co-location. A lot of people now have gone back to a very old interpretation of the Day of Atonement and saying that the scapegoat is actually being released to a demon named Azazel. This is something that came up in the early church fathers when they were riffing on some things that Jewish lore had told them about the Day of Atonement. It kind of went out of vogue, and now that we have the internet, it's back in vogue. So what you have is a sacrifice to a demon. This would fit the ransom to Satan theory. The ransom to Satan theory, talking about things that went out of vogue, basically went out of vogue in the 4th century. Gregory of Nazianzus basically put the nail in the coffin of all those ransom theories, but they've reared their ugly heads again. The atonement school from the Reformation forward has revived the ransom theory as a ransom to God theory. And now, with these same atonement schoolers, they inconsistently have a ransom to Satan theory in Leviticus chapter 16. But verses 1 through 8 put restrictions on when you can sacrifice cattle, sheep, and goats, farm animals, in other words. It says, and there you have it right there on the screen. Maybe you want to read verse 7.
And they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto devils, after whom they have gone a whoring. This shall be a statute forever unto them throughout their generations.
There you have it. In chapter 16, allegedly, according to these thinkers, the scapegoat is being released to the demon Azazel. It's a sacrifice. It's a ransom to Satan. Through an odd collocation of verses, the next chapter begins with a prohibition against sacrificing to devils.
Yeah.
Therefore, the scapegoat cannot possibly be a sacrifice to Azazel. It cannot be a ransom to Satan.
Yeah, I think what's more likely happening, if you want my 2 cents, is that the scapegoat is Nadab and Abihu, and just like Nadab and Abihu are put out of the camp with the refuse after their rebellion, the scapegoat is sent outside of the camp to send the sins out of the camp into the wilderness, into the refuse. And so what's going on here is not really propitiation, it's really expiation. If we want to be generous, if we want to be really generous about what's going on, it's expiation. It's removing the sins from the people. It's not actually God word. It's us word. It's removing the sins from us.
I very much like everything that you just said. Every word you said, I very much agree with. For those who are listening on audio or maybe don't have the visual up right now, when you said sin the sins, you did your little scare quote gestures because it is purely a symbolic representational sending of sin. I also love how you brought up the difference between propitiation and expiation. Very often, atonement schoolers sloppily use these as synonyms for each other. They are not exact synonyms. Expatriate or expiate, as you just described it, is very much like the idea of the word expatriate. Expatriate means to send something out of the country. And you just described expiate in a very similar way. I'm glad you brought that up. If you have any more words, keep bringing on the words of wisdom. I love it.
In fact, when it says Jesus is the propitiation, and we know that that word means mercy seat. Well, he's propitiation in only one sense, and that is that God is already propitious. Jesus is the result, not the cause, the result of the propitious attitude. And what Jesus accomplishes is expiation. That's why John the Baptist says, here's the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Jesus is taking sin away from us. He's not doing anything Godward.
Oh, let me tell you something, Daddy. If I weren't such a reserved and calm gentleman, I'd be jumping up and down, stamping my feet, yelling hallelujah and amen to everything you just said. I agree with everything you just said.
Yeah.
Yep, you sound like me, shipmate. What can I say?
Sound like you. That may or may not be a good thing, folks. We'll see.
No further comment on that. I'm gonna use the words of James White here. We're going to roll back the tape just a little bit, getting back to verses 1 through 8 of chapter 17. We talked about these peace offerings. These peace offerings are farm animals, cattle, sheep, and goat. Cattle, sheep, and goats. The first few sacrifices listed in Leviticus involve cattle, sheep, and goat, and they're voluntary sacrifices. Of your own free will, you can bring a holocaust, which is an animal that's completely burned, or you can bring an animal that's you can bring produce or fruit to be partially burned as a partial burnt offering or a partial holocaust if you want. I guess that'd be a contradiction in terms because olos, that's the hollow part of holocaust, means all. So you can't really have a partial all burnt offering. But anyway, you get what I'm driving at. What's going on here is God is saying you can offer up these Thanksgiving offerings, but you can't do it in your own home. And by the way, where was the Passover offered prior to Leviticus?
In the home.
It was offered in the home, and that comes to an end later in the Pentateuch. That's part of the punitive accommodation, because now they not only do they have to bring it to the tabernacle, but when the tabernacle becomes the temple and all of these tribes are spread out across Palestine, they have to go once a year on a long journey to Jerusalem to offer their lambs and sacrifice on Passover. It becomes a massive burden. And that's what this is designed to be. It's designed to be burdensome, to say, you want paganism? Sure. We'll give you all the burdensome features of paganism, but just enough to keep you from falling into worse paganism. That's where we are now. So God says you can sacrifice these farm animals as Thanksgiving offerings, but you have to do it at the door of the tabernacle. Verses 8 through 9, burnt offerings. Here we get the same thing. Burnt offerings have to be brought to the door of the tabernacle now. Now in verses 10 through 14, you have actually 10 through 16. We'll break it up in a moment. 10 through 16 are elaborations on kosher laws. So verses 10 through 14, it says you cannot eat blood. And in fact, the most famous passage in all of Leviticus is found here. It's Leviticus 17:11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. That's Leviticus 17:11.
Yeah, Seth brought this up the last time when we dealt with the fact that you're not supposed to eat blood. He brought this up as an objection to our position on this.
Right. We will get to that, I think, when we get to chapter 19. So that should be in today's episode. Okay, so no blood. And in this prohibition on blood, we get that famous line in Leviticus 17:11. Verses 15 through 16 continue these rules about kosher food. And it tells you may not eat carrion. In other words, you can't eat any roadkill or something that's died of itself, anything like that. We're done with chapter 17. We're now beginning chapter 18. Verses 1 through 5 tell us that we have, this is going to be a listing of judgments, ordinances, and statutes. Judgments, ordinances, and statutes. Throughout the book of Leviticus, those terms are not used consistently. Sometimes they're used as synonyms, and sometimes they're used to mean different things. I have a thesis that I'm working on. I'm not going to stand by it just yet, but it is a thesis that there are certain things that are called perhaps judgments that are everlasting, and then there are things that are called statutes, which can be dropped depending on time and circumstance. I'm not going to stand by that right at the moment because I'm still working on my analysis of Leviticus. But it's very clear to me that there are parts of Leviticus that are obviously obviated and parts that are not. We're coming into a part of the Bible that I think, a part of Leviticus that I think is not obviated. When you get to chapter 18 and you continue through until you get to, when you start at chapter 18 and you continue through to about chapter 26, what you have there is basically a reiteration of the Ten Commandments, but it's not just a reiteration, it's a very great elaboration thereon. When we get into chapter 10, the main commandment that is dealing with is the commandment on adultery. And if you have no objections, I'm going to share the screen at this point. Give me just a moment here.
I might have to. Oh, okay.
There it is. We're going to go through this chart. We'll do it very quickly. I'm hoping it's not going to glaze over everyone's eyes. But we have yet more evidence that the book of Leviticus is not reassembled properly. Because the book of Leviticus, when it talks about the Ten Commandments, is giving us code law. What we have in code law is an infraction immediately followed by the description of the punishment for that infraction. However, what we have in Leviticus is the sexual infraction is listed in chapter 18, and you don't get the punishment until we get to chapter 20. There's a whole chapter in between them. This makes absolutely no sense. What I've done then is to put them together. We begin, I'm scrolling upward here. In chapter 18, verse 20, you have what we think of as actual adultery. That's a man copulating with another man's wife. You have to go over to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10 to find out the punishment for that infraction. The punishment is death for both parties. Now, whether that draconian punishment is still in place or not, that can be disputed. But I think that adultery actually still is an infraction in the New Testament. I think even the most ardent Lutheran would agree with that. And, Martin Luther wanted to say the whole law was done away with.
Yeah. If I might pontificate quickly, I think that there are basically 4 types of law mentioned in the Bible. There are universal imperatives or universal principles. These are things like men are created in the image of God, love your neighbor as yourself, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Things of this sort, universal imperatives, things that are true throughout all the different laws that God institutes at all times. Then there is moral law, which is the morality that is common in both the Old and New Testaments. So things like don't kill, don't steal, moral things, ethical things. And then there is the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law, which is applicable only to the Jewish people. No Gentile was ever under the Mosaic law, even though they may be under the moral law and are certainly under the universal imperatives, both of which the Mosaic law contains, but they're not under the Mosaic law as a whole. And then there is the law of Christ, which comes from Jesus' teachings and the teachings of his apostles. And so we have those 4 types of law.
Jacob, I'm very amenably disposed to what you just described. In my opinion, what you ought to do is when you repurpose this video, use that little segment as a short and put it on your channel. Just an idea. We're going to go back to the spreadsheet. We've talked about adultery, one man copulating with another man's wife. When we come to verse 18, or chapter 18, verse 6, we have just a general prohibition on incest. The next verse is a prohibition against having sex with one's parents. That one's pretty obvious, but I guess in today's day and age, we need to reiterate, don't copulate with your parents. Now, we start getting into some specifics when we get to the next verse, which is chapter 18, verse 8. This forbids having sexual relations with your father's wife. So we're assuming that this is the woman who's not your actual mother. This is perhaps, men were polygamous in those days. He could have been one of his other wives, or perhaps he's monogamous and the first wife has died or been divorced, and this is the new wife. Go ahead.
And if I'm not mistaken, doesn't it say don't sleep with your father's wife, for she is your father's nakedness, or something like that?
Yeah, it uses those turns of phrase. If you're using the King James, it uses those turns of phrase. Okay, the punishment for this, if you copulate with your stepmother, that is to say your father's wife, the penalty is death. That's in chapter 20, verse 11.
Yeah.
Going back to chapter 18, where we have the infraction listed, you cannot copulate with your aunt, that is to say your mother's sister. Okay, then you get a little more specific here in verse 12. It tells you also cannot copulate with your father's sister. So you cannot copulate with an aunt on either side of your family. When we go to chapter 20, verse 19, we find the penalty, therefore, they shall bear their iniquity. That's King James language. That's pretty vague. Most commentators believe that means they will be killed.
Yeah.
Okay. Going down back to chapter 18, we're at verse 14. This is a prohibition against copulating with one's uncle's wife. Going to chapter 20, verse 20, we have to jump over chapter 19 to get to the penalty for that infraction. Quote, they shall die childless, end quote. I put a question mark at the end of that. This is that vague Old Testament language being filtered through the equally vague language of the King James Bible. They shall die childless. What we can assume that means is you kill them before the baby conceived by their sexual union begins to gestate. That's what we can assume it means. In other words, they die. Same punishment for the other sexual infractions. Chapter 18, verse 9. The infraction is you cannot copulate with your full sister. That is to say, this sister who came from the same father and mother that you did, nor can you copulate with a half-sister, whether that half-sister is legitimate or illegitimate. This is also listed in Deuteronomy 27:22, if you want a further cross-reference. Okay, we jump from verse 9 to verse 11. This talks about the half-sister. So we're not talking about a full sister anymore. We're talking just about the half-sister. That relationship is forbidden. The penalty for that infraction is found in chapter 20, verse 17. The people are, quote unquote, cut off. Cut off basically means executed as well. If you want to be really favorably inclined, really generous, you can say, no, it just means they'll be cut off from the community, i.e. exiled. Well, if you're in the wilderness generation and you're exiled from the community, you're probably going to die because you're being thrust out into that harsh desert where it's very difficult to survive. If you're a scapegoat, conceivably, you can survive because goats can eat just about any kind of scrub or vegetation and thrive. As long as they have some kind of scrub, some kind of vegetation, and some water source, they're good to go. Human beings are not goats. We depend on community, and without it, we will probably die. So, in my opinion, cut off means you're killed. Or maybe you're exiled, but then the ultimate result of that exile is death.
It's death. Why isn't there specifically a death penalty for full sister here?
When we go back to full sister, that was chapter 18, verse 9. When you go to Deuteronomy 27:22, it says that the person who copulates with his full sister is to be cursed.
Okay.
So whatever they meant by cursed in Deuteronomy 27 is what happens to a person who copulates with his sister. These things in some cases are maddeningly vague. I mean, there are some of these penalties where they say the person will be burned, or the person will be stoned, or the person will die. Those are nice and clear. Some of the rest of them are extremely vague. Again, this is why the Bible requires apologetics, because if I'm going to step on some apologetics toes here, the Bible is not a well-written book. If it were, you would not need apologetics.
Yeah.
Plato and Aristotle do not need apologists because Plato and Aristotle were good writers. Then again, Plato and Aristotle were incredibly brilliant. The people who compiled the Old Testament were not, by and large. All right, that's enough.
Yeah, all I gotta say is that the people in Alabama are in trouble.
All right, I just offended half the audience, and now you offended me because
I'm just kidding.
Half of my family is Alabamian, tough guy.
You know it's a joke. Come on.
You just stepped in yogurt, Big Daddy. Stepped in yogurt.
It's not everybody in Alabama.
But Jesus says turn the other cheek, so I'm going to pretend you didn't say that, and I'm going to carry on with looking at this spreadsheet of ours. We were talking about the sister-in-law, the brother's wife. The infraction is penalized with their dying childless. There's that phrase again. Going back to chapter 18, verse 15, you have the daughter's son-in-law, or you have the daughter-in-law. That is to say, your son's wife, your daughter-in-law. You are not allowed to copulate with her. The penalty is death, as stated in chapter 20, verse 12. Chapter 18, verse 10, you are forbidden to copulate with your grandchildren.
Ew.
There is no, it happens, otherwise there would be no rule against it. There is no cross-reference for this, not even in Deuteronomy. So we don't know what the punishment is. It just says don't do it.
It's probably death.
It's very likely. Yeah, it's very likely. But then again, if you want to be if you've got a lawyer defending a person who has copulated with his or her grandchildren, the lawyer can point out in a court of law, wait a minute, you cannot pass a sentence of death because it's not specifically stated in the Bible.
Yeah, there's no code law sentence. Do you think, hold on, before we go any further, do you think that sometimes when there is no sentence associated, that they just didn't have that part of Leviticus in their collective memory?
All I can do there is speculate. That's quite probable. Because because chapter 18 lists the infractions and chapter 20 lists the penalties for those infractions, and the infractions are sometimes missing.
Yeah.
So you're probably right, but all we can do is speculate. We can't dogmatize on that because we just don't have enough information either way.
Yeah.
We're going
So
from,
basically, guys, all these offenses are probably death sentence offenses, even when it doesn't say.
I'm very liable to agree with that. We're going to go from these rules on incest to a couple of rules against polygyny. Let me explain that term. We all know what the term polygamy is. Polygamy is when one spouse has multiple spouses. And then we want to make it more specific. You say polyandry. That's when the woman has multiple husbands at the same time. Or you can have the far more common practice of polygyny, which is one man having multiple wives at the same time. There is no tradition for polyandry in the Bible. The only polygamous tradition in the Bible is polygyny, a man with multiple wives. So I could just say polygamy, because in the Bible that means polygyny, but I'll say polygyny just to be excruciatingly precise. Again, I'm going to point out something controversial here. This is something the apologetics industrial complex has to explain. There is no prohibition on polygamy anywhere in the Bible except on New Testament clergy. New Testament clergy are confined to one wife. All throughout the Old Testament, polygamy is not simply tolerated, it's actually enforced. And the Bible tells us that God sometimes rewards men whom he likes by giving them multiple sex partners, multiple wives, and multiple concubines. I just got myself in a lot more trouble, but I don't see any way to get around this. And the New Testament says nothing about this. The prohibition on polygamy among Christians is a church tradition.
Yeah.
I repeat, it is a church tradition.
Yeah.
And if you think that all traditions exterior to the Bible are quote unquote traditions of men and therefore need to be jettisoned, then you need
You'll
to
be a polygamist.
Yeah, you need to jettison monogamy, because in the Old Testament, polygamy is a reward from God for good behavior. No getting around it. Now, I'm not saying I'm in favor of polygyny. I'm certainly not in favor of polyandry. I think polygamy is generally a disaster. And if you want to see that, you can see it in action in some of these towns in northern Arizona where fundamentalist Mormons still practice it. Towns like Colorado City, or you can go to Bountiful, I think it's Bountiful, British Columbia. They practice this. John Krakauer had a whole book on polygamy, and it's just a mess figuring out who's related to whom and so on and so forth. But let me get back to our list here. If you are going to practice polygamy, you are not allowed to marry a mother and her daughter. That's forbidden. And when you go to chapter 20, verse 14, the punishment for that infraction is the death penalty for all three persons. The husband, the mother, and the daughter. All three of them are put to death. The reason you have this draconian rule is because this kind of relationship is going to lead very quickly to all kinds of incestuous entanglements. Mm-hmm. We can see that in action again in John Krakauer's book. John Krakauer wrote a book called Under the Banner of Heaven. This is where he, as an investigative journalist, looked into Mormon polygamy. I think it was primarily in those towns in northern Arizona. Whatever town was run by Rulon Jeffs, who was then succeeded by Warren Jeffs. And in one chapter of the book, he has this family tree. And the branches of the tree are crossing each other all over the place. It's an absolute disaster. So you're only steps away from all kinds of incestuous births and relationships if you allow this kind of polygyny. That's why it's forbidden. Now we come to chapter 18, verse 18. This is another prohibition on polygyny. If you are going to have more than one wife at a time, they're not allowed to be two sisters. That means if we apply this rule ex post facto, Jacob is in a lot of trouble because he was married to Rachel and Leah, who were two sisters. But you see from the stories of Jacob that those marriages didn't work out very well at all. They were a messy entanglement. That's why this is forbidden. We're going on from polygyny to prostitution. In chapter 9, we're jumping from chapter 18, and this is our first foray into chapter 19. Chapter 19, verse 29. An Israelite must not prostitute his daughter. And we don't know if that means it's okay to consort with prostitutes who are not Israelites. If you want to be extremely legalistic about this, you can say it's fine to consort with prostitutes as long as they're not Israelite. You can use foreign prostitutes, and that's okay. Again, you can make a case for or against what I just said. I'm not advocating for prostitution at this point. I'm just saying this is not a clear rule against all prostitution. It's a rule against your own race being prostitutes. Chapter 18, verse 9. In chapter 18, verse 9, men are forbidden from copulating with women who are on their period. If a woman is menstruous, you are not allowed to copulate with her. Chapter 20, verse 18, unbelievably draconian. If you do, you are killed.
Yeah.
There is a real fixation on blood in the book of Leviticus. This is just a continuation of that. So in my opinion, if the infractions are still in place, then obviously the punishments are going to have to be relaxed depending on the times and circumstances that we're now in. We go from that to chapter 18, verse 22. This is a prohibition against homosexuality. The penalty for homosexuality is death. From homosexuality, we go to bestiality. That is to say, a human being copulating with an animal. When we get to chapter 20, there are two verses that explain the penalty for that infraction. It gives you one verse that tells you how the man is to be killed, and it gives you a second verse that tells you how the woman are going to be killed. I think, well, this is one of the few times where it lists what happens to a woman, because most of these sexual infractions assume that the infraction is being done by a man. You know, it says you will not copulate with your father's wife. You will not copulate with your uncle's wife. This assumes that the person doing the copulating is a man. This time it gives you, it singles out men, and then it singles out women.
Yeah.
So apparently in the land of Canaan, where these guys were going, it was a common thing for women to copulate with animals. This might have been something they did in live sex performances. We don't know. There is a book that is the only surviving intact novel from pagan Rome. The book is called The Golden Ass. It was written by Apuleius. And in this book, there's a scene where a condemned murderess is going to be killed by wild animals in the arena. But before she's killed, they force her to copulate with a donkey. And the donkey happens to be the lead character who has been magically transformed into that beast. So a lot of disgusting things going on, and those are all forbidden. Okay, now we're coming back to that phrase we used earlier, judgments, ordinances, and statutes. All of these sexual infractions and their penalties are categorized as judgments, ordinances, and statutes. So it's going to take a lot of study to parse out which one refers to a law that's been done away with and which one refers to a law that's still intact. I've stopped sharing my screen, and we have gone through chapters 18, 19, and 20 in some detail. We're skipping over quite a bit. Well, not quite a bit. There are some items still left in those chapters. There are items that deal with magic, with sacrificing one's offspring to Molech. We'll let the subscribers go back and look at those things on their own. I want us to go on to chapter 21, which I believe is our final chapter for today.
Yep.
Chapter 21, we're getting into priestly regulations. We're going to have a distinction between rank and file priests and the high priest. So all of the sons of Aaron were priests, but only Aaron, and then later the one designated after his death, would be the high priest. So there's one high priest at a time, except in certain odd times in Jewish history. For a rank and file priest, he is forbidden to go to any funeral except for the funeral of his immediate family. That strikes us as really bizarre because in Eastern Orthodoxy, in Catholicism, the priest is the one who performs the funeral ceremony.
Yeah.
And in Protestantism, the pastor is the one that performs the funeral ceremony.
Yeah.
That's forbidden in Leviticus. We don't know who performs the ceremony. It's probably not the priest. He is allowed to attend the funeral, but only for the funeral of his immediate family. If it's somebody who's more distantly related, he can't go. It's considered something that makes him ceremonially unclean.
It's probably the patriarch of the family that performs
That's quite possible. That's quite possible because prior to the golden calf incident, there was a sacrificing liturgical priesthood, which consisted of Aaron and his sons. And then there was a priesthood of all believers. This is mentioned in Exodus 19, verse 6. It was the priesthood of all believers was fathers and firstborn sons. We talked earlier about how the Passover was offered up in the house. It was offered up by the father and the firstborn son. Later, that's done away with. Part of the punishment of Israel for the golden calf incident is the removal of that priesthood of all believers, and it's replaced with the Levitical priesthood. So after this, after the golden calf, you end up with an Aaronic priesthood, which you already had, but its duties are greatly expanded and made much more onerous. And then you have a Levitical priesthood. The Levites are made priests in Exodus chapter 32, which is the golden calf incident. Going back to chapter 21.
Also, I have another thought. In pagan religions, say Egypt, there was a lot of pagan tomfoolery at funerals performed by the priests. And so it may be that God forbids the priest to perform the funeral because he doesn't want the tomfoolery that was going on to say honor the god Osiris or something like that in Egypt.
That sounds like a very credible hypothesis to me, because we know that in certain pagan societies, a lot of tomfoolery did go on, and in certain cases, the tomfoolery was actually deadly. For example, the Roman Empire shared the Italian peninsula with a number of other civilizations, and they were frequently at war with these civilizations. And when in times of peace, they frequently borrowed from these civilizations. Two of these civilizations were the Etruscans and the Lucanians. The Etruscans and the Lucanians had funeral games at which two gladiators fought it out over the barrow of the freshly interred dead person. So their blood going down into the funeral barrow was believed to be a propitiation of the spirits of the dead, because the spirits of the dead were thought to be unhappy. They had to be propitiated. So you propitiated them at your funerals, at their funeral, with blood of gladiators, probably POWs or enslaved people. The Romans picked up on that during the First Carthaginian War, the First Punic War, and then that gradually evolved into the massive entertainment spectacle that they had. And these gladiatorial games maintained an element of symbolism because some of the gladiators were dressed as Thracians, or they were dressed as Lucanians, other Italians, in other words, because these were the enemies of Rome. And then when they were fighting it out in the arena, the enemy was being symbolically destroyed. We've gotten a little far afield. Let's get back to chapter 21.
Yeah, let's get through chapter 21. I'm sorry, I keep having thoughts.
Chapter 21. So the priestly regulations for rank and file priests, there's certain rules about how they can wear their hair and beard. A priest is not allowed to shave his head, and he's not allowed to have certain trims of beard. There's a lot of controversy over why that is or whatever. But what's key to me in this particular section is verse 6, where it says, because they offer up the bread of their God. This is another anthropomorphism. They're making the priests look like they're offering up food that's actually going to be consumed by God. We all know that this is mocked later in the Bible. In Leviticus, it's there because it's an accommodation to their pagan mindset. I don't know if I've said it on this series yet, but I'm very fond in private conversation of saying paganism makes smart people stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly smart civilizations like the Maya, the Aztec, the ancient Romans did stupid, inexplicable things because they were ordered to by their pagan religion. Pagan religion makes people do stupid things. The idea that you're serving up food to an actual God is stupid. But God accommodates them with this because they are so pagan-minded at this, they being the Hebrews, they are so pagan-minded at this point in their history. As we move on into the prophets, this is ridiculed and the idea is dropped. We're going on to verses 7 through 8. Rank and file priests have certain regulations on whom they are allowed to take as wives. If you are a priest, you're allowed to be married, but you are not allowed to be married to an ex-prostitute or to a divorcee. And again, the reason is because they, quote, offer up the bread of their God, end quote. So this is another rule that's linked to their anthropomorphic understanding of God. Verse 9. If a priest's daughter is sexually active, the punishment for her is to be burned alive. I'm going to leave that one without any further comment. I'll let the apologists handle why that's there. Chapter 21, verse 10. Now we're talking about the high priest. The head of the high priest has to be covered at all times, and he cannot rend his clothes. Going on to verse 11. We had funeral regulations earlier for rank and file priests. The high priest, the high priest is not allowed to go to any funeral, period. Not even for his immediate family. That's banned. No funerals for the high priest. Chapter 21, verse 12, there's an extremely obscure, vaguely worded passage about the priest being forced to stay in the tabernacle if he is the high priest. It says, while the oil is upon him. So perhaps we can assume that when the oil is still wet on him during these ceremonies, he's not permitted to exit the tabernacle. Once it's dry, then he is allowed to exit. This can't possibly mean that he's perpetually stuck in the tabernacle because there are just no living quarters in the tabernacle. Where is he going to live? Verses 13 through 15, talking about the high priest again. These are regulations on what kind of woman the high priest can take as a wife. He again is forbidden to be married to an ex-prostitute or to a divorcee, but he's also forbidden from marrying a foreigner. So there's no race mixing allowed if you are the high priest. This prohibition on marrying foreigners is not found on the rank and file priests. So we could speculate that rank and file priests are allowed to marry foreign women if they convert to the Israelite religion.
Would if someone was in line, like let's do a little speculation here. If someone was in line to be the high priest, and they decide to take a foreign wife, does that automatically disqualify them?
I would guess that would disqualify them from being high priest. They could probably continue as in the Aaronic order, but they simply could not be promoted to high priest.
Gotcha.
I'm guessing there. We find in the Gospel of Luke that by the time you get to the New Testament period, there were what they called courses of priests. So certain, I guess we could say, squadrons of priests would have duties on XYZ day, and then a different squadron would come in and have it on ABC day. This is something that would require a lot more research on my part, but I'm going to guess that if a priest, while he is rank and file, has taken a foreign wife, he can remain a priest, but he cannot be promoted to high priest.
Gotcha. That would be my assumption as well. I just wanted to see what your assumption is.
We are moving on to chapter 21, verses 16 through 21. At this point, the priestly regulations go back to describing rank and file priests. We've been talking about the high priest. Now we're going back to rank and file priests. If a person is physically disfigured, if he's deformed in any way, he cannot be a priest. He cannot serve in the tabernacle. He is allowed to partake of the bread that the priests have as food, but he's not allowed to serve in the tabernacle. Moving on to verses 22 through 24. That's where it tells us that, again, that's the conclusion of the passage, telling us that the priests can have the bread, but they cannot serve if they are physically disfigured. And we are at the end of what we had planned to do today. I have nothing further to share.
You have nothing further to share?
Nothing at all.
Well, we went a little longer, actually. The last two episodes have been 114. We made it to 120. Actually, 121 just now. So anyways, hold on. Stop sharing. I want to let's see if I can do this. I want to put this on the screen one more time for people that joined us after we started, and for people later so they see it twice. So if you go to my channel, and I'm going to put it, hold on, live. I'm going to put it on the, wait a minute, on part 4. If you go to my channel and you go to the bottom of this video, I'm going to do this one more time before we close out. You go to the bottom of the channel, or the bottom of the video, you can see Paul, wait a minute. You can see paulvendredi.com or Paul Vendredi,
my YouTube channel.
I forgot to make your link on these an actual link for your website.
That's an outrage.
I forgot to do that, but I will go back and do that. I'm just now noticing that. I am sorry. It is an indiscretion on my part. Anyways, so Paul Vendredi, Christian Theological Archive. Make sure you subscribe to those. Go to my link tree. Here's all my socials, Tattered Bible Plus, all this stuff. Here is all of the channels that I currently endorse. There's Paul Vendredi. Here is some churches. I'm going to add more as time goes. And here's some good books.
If I may do a plug, I noticed you had the Church Split listed as one of those channels. I'm going to be on the Church Split this Friday.
Excellent. So, Will, if you're listening, we're going to give a plug to you. Go to the Church Split, like, share, and subscribe. Anyways, I want to close out in prayer as usual. Paul, as usual, you're free to stay around and shoot the breeze or what have you afterwards. If you have something that needs to be done, I bid you adieu, but I'm going to pray now. Dear Lord, Thank you for this episode. Thank you that we can reach people with this work that we're doing. Thank you for the fellowship that we have. Help the message that we spread here today to touch someone. In Jesus' name, amen. Just a minute.
We believe in one God, as revealed by Scripture in the person of Jesus Christ. Study to show yourselves approved.